Okay, so continuing on from the last presentation on the origin and the source of liberalism, I tried to put chapter 7 of Dostoevsky's Bezi, or The Possessed, or Devils, in the Constant Garnet translation in the YouTube of the last one, but it didn't fit, so I'm going to instead put a link to that text, which I put in a Google Docs file, but you can also go to the Project Gutenberg website and get that text, which is in the public domain, free, and go and read chapter 7. That's our door into Strauss. The most obvious key word there is where it speaks of, where in the discussion between Shatov and Stravagin, we have the words, you have unconsciously reduced God to an attribute of a nation. So this is the end result of Strauss's thinking and struggling with the Zionism issue, where Zionism becomes cultural Zionism or national Zionism, is this view that we get a realpolitik Zionism, which until not long ago was embodied by Netanyahu, interest politics. So we're following the old method, which is accepted. Don't confuse the word method with the idea of scientific method, rather than scientific principles, but method just in the sense of a manner of investigation. And it may be what Strauss would refer to as a law of reason. He gives the example, or a dictate of reason, I think is the phrase he uses. He gives the example of voting, that you can't do voting any other way but to have the side with the most votes win. It's a simple law of reason. So in the same way, perhaps also a law of reason is that what's presented in the sophist text, that if we start from the things that are closer to us and therefore in a way simpler, we can then move to the more complicated things, and that's the best way to proceed. So therefore we're starting with people that are still alive. The antipathy, the strong antipathy between Zizek, who indeed does not even speak the name Dugin because he considers Dugin an obscenity, and Dugin. And we're using them to go towards Strauss and Heidegger. So Heidegger's view ostensibly would be that there's we can't use reason as the first step. We can't say that even if that is the law of reason, why can't morality, which means almost the same thing as trust, or experience and empathy, being able to understand something, come first? In speech, we disclose in various ways, and reason is only one of them, I believe Heidegger would say. Whereas Strauss is more in keeping with Plato, looking for dictates of reason. So to begin with, I want to flesh out this idea, which is suggested already by the text we've read, where Strauss is saying, speaking of the interdependence of the Germans on the English. And we're going to show that, I'm going to attempt to show that Zizek is, and also that implies a corresponding aversion to everything Russian. So Zizek is taking the English side here. Clearly, the subject of interdependence is a crucial subject for Strauss, and there's an Arabic essay concerning that, and it points to the situation of the Jews in the period of the Convivencia, when there were Christians, Muslims, and Jews in Spain, and the Jews were had some freedom prior to the harsher parts of the Inquisition, which in some ways lasted 500 years or so. Strauss does say, so the thing is that you can have some political rights but be inwardly bound by the doctrine that's going on, and this is what Strauss is saying about Jews in the period when he grew up, where the Jewish religion was no longer properly accepted, and he came to that conclusion after long study, especially long engagement with Zionism. Zionism becomes cultural Zionism, and then it becomes, at length, until recently, we had the Netanyahu example of realpolitik or interestpolitik Zionism. And Netanyahu all the time made comments along the lines that he thought that it's good that the Torah was studied, it's good that the ancient languages were studied, but this is a kind of cultural Zionism. It's the religion isn't the main thing, and having the state is viewed as the solution to the human problem, or to, as Strauss says numerous times, that the Jewish problem or Jewish question, Judenfrage, can be taken as an exemplar of the human problem, and that the human problem cannot be solved through establishing a state. And therefore, Zionism, he has to break with Zionism at age 30. The interdependence of the Jews at the time, according to him, stem from the coming into practice of the thinking of, in contradistinction to the Spanish Jews who studied the philosophic tradition as something which was true and simply the truth, the Jews were compelled to regard what they learned in Germany, science, which is based on first established in places like the Royal Society largely, and then came in its English guise, science as we now know it, in contradistinction to what Heidegger or Strauss taught, which is science where, for instance, the law is considered a science. Anything is considered a science where you are consistent in your terms, and where you base things on ideas such as the notion that there's dictates of reason and that they can be identified. Clearly, they can't be identified by the means of the procedures of a science which is based on observation of an external object. That would be an internal object, however. So this is the metaphysical science. But both metaphysical science and what we'll call it English science, Husserl refers to this as European science, because of course it's developed largely in Germany also, but not with the same principle of understanding of its place necessarily, although the universities in Prussia were divided in 1848, and that was the first major part where this division between the humanities and the proper sciences in the way we now understand sciences as, from the German point of view, as that form of philosophy which won out. From the English point of view, which is the Zizek point of view, we have this sense that the sciences are about the blind nature and observation of external things. So let's try to show why liberalism in Zizek's guise is opposed to other thinking, the Russian thinking. Let me see, I don't know if I should read this. There's not enough time in the video, but I'll just, what I want to establish is that we have a number of positive legal dictates which tell us what liberalism is. So, for instance, in the United States, there's the 14th Amendment is one of the core centers around which liberalism moves. So that's the amendment which establishes the equal protections provision. This then creates a lever by which anyone who says they're being harmed in some way can step in and appeal to that lever. It became necessary. Of course, that came in with the Civil War, but it became necessary also because of the breakdown of a simple, unified view of what was trustable or what was moral. What I want to say is these positive legal principles of liberalism, we can separate them out and show that they stand on a different ground than the basic ground of liberalism, which is probably going to explain why Zizek isn't in that well with liberals in the sense of AOC or the Democrats, because what they're appealing to is legal liberalism, not necessarily to the Constitution prior to the amendments, but to the Constitution in the amendments. Zizek rather often attacks this by saying, of course, when you have this breakdown of the trust in a certain moral principles, they're going to have all these, the political correctness comes in and it is arbitrary. But this is not the basic ground of liberalism that we're trying to get to. So Zizek, but I give it, before this ends, I want to give it one proof that Zizek is on the side of England. So we can make, not only for the use of clarity, but also because it's probably true, the source of liberalism in the more fundamental way has a great deal to do with England, and England being until 1500 part of the Catholic world, 1525 or so, and the division between the Catholic world and the Orthodox Christianity, which is represented by Russia, and which we see the Ukraine right now is the site where that conflict is happening more visibly than in many other places. So Zizek makes this joke, which isn't totally a joke. It's a kind of anecdote, which is about the Balkans. But let's let Balkans somehow stand for Russia. So, because it stands for everything bad, as it were, in contradistinction to everything good in the West. So Zizek says, in Slovenia, people say, no, we're not part of the Balkans, we're Middle Europa. And if you want to go to the Balkans, you have to go to Croatia. You have to go a little bit east and south. And then Croatia points you to Serbia a little further to the south or east. And the Serbians say, no, wait a minute, we're Christian people. You better go to Kosovo. Maybe if you go to Kosovo, and maybe if you go a little farther, you'll get to some archaic Macedonians who are not even, maybe they're, Faith J. Goody is from, I think her heritage is Macedonian. So maybe you'll get to something even worse if you go to Macedonia, some archaic, the furthest point from England. And if you go the other way, he says, the Germans think they're more European than the Austrians more than the Slovenians, and the French think they're even more advanced than the Germans. And the English point and say, look at this Constantinople, which is Brussels, and all these other heathens. And Zizek says he agrees with this to some extent. So he identifies himself with the banking centers in London, and so that might sound like a negative, like a deliberately negative account of Zizek, but it's not, because Zizek bases his account on the Hegelian notion that when we're run by money, this creates a persona which is universal. So everybody understands themselves as an economic agent, as having a profession or a job, and thereby everybody understands themselves as something which everybody else understands themselves as, something universal, in contradistinction to, for instance, what Dugin always talks about, the different stratum of society where you would have warriors, for instance. The warriors wouldn't understand being a warrior as a profession, but rather as it's just what they are. So it's more like a tribal person who is simply undifferentiated. So there's no universality without the economic system. And the economic system has its center, according to Zizek, in the banking centers of London. And so we could go into the history of that. And of course, I know there's the Dutch golden era sparks off the economic dominance in Northern Europe and then goes to England only later. But that's a long story and we could go into it. But what I want to say is we're justified in understanding Zizek as presenting the English case and as the origin of liberalism in its deeper basis, and then we can look at what stands in contradistinction to that. Maybe I can read this last passage, but maybe we'll run out of time. So this is from the Dostoevsky. You believe that Roman Catholicism, not Christianity. You asserted that Rome proclaimed Christ subject to the third temptation of the devil, announcing to all the world that Christ without an earthly kingdom cannot hold its ground on earth. Catholicism, by doing so, proclaimed Antichrist and ruined the whole Western world. So that all that's standard. We know this Eastern Orthodox propaganda against the Pope and against the Bishop of Rome. But the next part is very interesting. You pointed that in France is, you pointed that if France is agonizing now, it's simply the fault of Catholicism, for she has rejected the wicked God of Rome and has not found a new one. So that's very interesting. It's absolutely parallel in a different region to what is said of Socrates for destroying the gods of Athens but not establishing a new one. And of course we should note that here it's said specifically, for Catholicism has rejected the wicked God of Rome but not established a new one. So the God of Rome refers not to, of course, to Catholic Rome or to the Pope, but to Rome itself. So Rome under, Cicero, Caesar, and so forth. So let's talk more about that in the next presentation.